Hey there, everybody. It's me again. I am back in Gettysburg once more, even though I told you I wouldn't be. Hasn't been very long since the last video. So, just so you know, whenever I say I'm not going to come back for a while, that's a lie. Don't believe me. Do not believe me. It's a lie. Anyways, I have to shoot this, unfortunately, inside the car. And it is extremely, extremely windy, but I want to go over, I've covered, and I don't mean to go over every single battle and visit every single site with you guys. That's not really my point. I love Gettysburg. I love this place. I love the history, but I am not a battlefield guide, and these videos are really just kind of for newbies and kind of just to share my passion and egg you guys on to come visit this place because I love it. And I love the battlefield, and I love the history, and I love everything about Gettysburg. As I've said, I love town, I love the brewery, I love lots of things. I just love being here. I love being away from the urban environment of the Baltimore, Howard County area. So anyways, I've kind of covered some, some different parts of the war, I'm sorry, of the battle, and I've covered some of the middle and later actions or battles within the larger Battle of Gettysburg. But today I wanted to start from the beginning, or to go back to the beginning. So what we are looking at right here, sorry, there's a little stuff on my, right there, windows. So forgive me, but I've got to do it this way. It is way too windy. There's no way I can do it otherwise. So we are looking at the monuments to John Buford and to John Reynolds of the Union. And we are basically almost at the point where the war began. I'm sorry, where the Battle of Gettysburg began again. Now, about 1 mile up the street, which is now Lincoln Highway, but which used to be Chambersburg Pike, is the first shot marker. That's about a mile up the road. I think it was the 8th Illinois Cavalry who gets the credit for that. There was some dispute, but I think they kind of settled on it and settled on that being the first actual shot that rang out around 7:30 in the morning on July the 1st, 1863. However, it was just skirmishing, and as I've mentioned before, a lot of events like that are kind of probing in nature, and one of those things where the armies are trying to feel each other out, see how many troops there are coming down the road, what have you. But around this area is where the first battle really began, the first battle of the entire battle, larger battle of Gettysburg. So I pan over here and zoom in a little bit. Over here we have the McPherson farm as well, and I'm going to get back to that a little bit. But as far as the battle goes, we had again John Reynolds and we had John Buford. I'm sorry, John Buford is on the left. John Reynolds is on horseback. As far as these depictions and monuments go, John Buford was the first one here, and he like a lot of other battles that I may or may not have mentioned, kind of like Lew Wallace and Monocacy, he knows he is not here to win the fight, to win the immediate battle at hand. He knows he may very well be outnumbered, and his job is to stall. First of all, he wants to stall and buy all Union troops who are coming into Gettysburg more time to assemble on the higher ground, of course, which is the south to the south of town. Well, I mean, starting with Culp's Hill as well. He wants to buy time so the Union can eventually make their way to places like Culp's Hill, to places like Little Round Top, and so on, and to afford the time for them to gain the advantage, because the rebels still haven't made it that far yet either. It's kind of a race to the high ground, or a race to the prime spots on what would become the battlefield of Gettysburg. So John Buford is really just trying to buy time for that purpose, and also to buy time for this man to arrive, because he doesn't have that many troops at his disposal. I don't know exact numbers. Again, I am not a battlefield guide. But John Reynolds is on the way, and I'm pretty sure he knows that Reynolds is coming to more or less bail him out. So he is trying to stall as long as he can. Back over here, beyond the tree line, we have Willoughby Run. And as best as I know, again, I can be wrong here, but as best as I know and understand, that there was skirmishing and part of the battle on the other side of this tree line, or on the other side of Willoughby Run. But eventually Buford got beaten back a bit, and he had to come back to this side of Willoughby Run and to this general area over here. And that was probably around the time, I think, when John Reynolds finally arrived. As far as the Confederate brigades and generals, we had one J.J. Archer, or James J. Archer. He is actually a Marylander, which I'm not proud or ashamed of, but James J. Archer, a little bit about him, he actually hailed from a very, very small town outside of what is now Havre de Grace. And interestingly enough, or not, he was actually into law before he signed up with the army, and eventually put his money down with the Confederates. Because again, Maryland is a border state that could have well gone either way. But when he was studying law, he went to Princeton at first, because of course that was one of the first schools in the nation. And interestingly enough, one of the earlier state schools in the nation was the University of Maryland, so that's where he passed the bar. So James J. Archer is the Confederate who is on his way across the, so there are a bunch of smaller ridges back behind there. You can't see them. What you're seeing way off in the distance is actually the South Mountain Range. But between this tree line and the South Mountain Range, there are a number of successive ridges. So that's the direction that Archer was coming from. Again, this is kind of the northwest side of town. And that's where the Confederates first started pouring in. So again, Buford eventually does get beaten back because he just doesn't have that many men. Eventually John Reynolds does finally arrive. I'm not saying he was late. He just, he finally comes to the aid of John Buford, and they are able to put up a good fight for a while. Now, of course, J.J. Archer was not the only Confederate, and I don't think that Buford and Reynolds knew exactly how many more Confederates would be coming from this line of attack. I'm sure that if I were them, I would be worried that the Confederates may be flanking into town, or in other words, some Confederates might be pouring in from the northwest, while some Confederates might be pouring in from the southwest. I'm not sure how good the intelligence was. Again, I am not the expert here, but eventually they got beaten back, and because there were many more Confederates, I think, than they were not expecting, but hoping for, at least. Behind James J. Archer, there was also General Davis, General Pettigrew, and a General Pender. Funny thing about General Pender is he was kind of known for leading a kind of a chicken poop, fraidy cat, ragtag bunch of Confederates, and they proved that once again here at this very battle, because at some point in the battle, they probably wanted to say that they got lost, but or turned around the woods or something, but they actually eventually kind of stalled and hid in a not in a ravine, but in a quarry, or more or less in a ravine. And it was quite embarrassing, but they lived up to their reputation as being a bunch of cowards. So anyways, they eventually, the Union eventually has to pull back, and unfortunately, John Reynolds was killed in action by Archer's brigade back in the woods. The part of the woods that he actually was killed in belonged to a man named John Herbst. So just to throw another name in there, John Herbst owned property back there as well. And interestingly enough, he is one of the very, very lucky people in any of these stories. John Herbst that was lucky enough to keep his property in the end. It was pretty miraculous. Now, the story is that he kind of stood firm and defended his property, and that's not entirely true. Now, he stayed there. So, I mean, that was the biggest part and the bravest thing that he did. But he kind of got lucky in the fact that when a Confederate general eventually came by and wanted to burn the place, as they always do, for practical reasons, tactical reasons, not to be evil, which was usually not the case. But there were a couple wounded men lying there on the floor of Herbst's property. To my knowledge, there could have been more, but I know that, well, at least according to the American Battlefield Trust, there were at least two at least two Union wounded in his home, and at least one Confederate Union in his home. And out of those, at least 3 soldiers, at least a Confederate, could not be moved, and possibly the others as well. But they were all pretty seriously wounded. I believe they were all lying on the floor, either with bleeding, or with shattered bones from many balls or what have you. But they could not be moved. So the Confederate general who came to Herbst's house, eventually decided that he was going to leave the property be. So John Herbst was amazingly one of the very, very few people in any of these stories who actually survived, stayed pat at his place, and escaped with his life and his home intact. Now, getting back to the McPherson farm, the McPherson farm was owned by a congressional representative who was not there at the time. It was occupied by a man named John Slentz. John Slentz was married to a lady named Eliza Herr, well, I think who eventually took his name, or it's kind of confusing to me. She might have been a hyphen in the name. It could have been Eliza Slentz Herr. But anyways, Eliza Herr was also the daughter of a man named Frederick Herr, who also owned property, a tavern in specific, back in that same general area. They both, of course, left in a hurry. Well, the men of the house, John Slentz, I believe, was in town, and he and I think another male, I think somebody who worked on the farm, as is often the case, they took the horses and kind of took the lead, got out first, and took the horses to try to save their most precious property, which was their best livestock. However, unfortunately, they did not make it with their livestock. They were intercepted at some point, but I believe they lived. I know that Eliza Herr, or Eliza Slentz, and possibly John Slentz as well, eventually made it to Baltimore Street. They stayed temporarily with a man named Harvey Sweeney, who, I'm sorry, that house was actually, well, it's now known as the Farnsworth House, so it's down there on Baltimore Avenue. But they were only there temporarily, and eventually they had to relocate to the Lutheran Seminary on Seminary Ridge, where I believe a lot of other people were holed up who had to flee. And it was, of course, a harrowing experience, as you can imagine. They were, leaving that I believe. Now, let me see. The barn stayed in place. I don't think the house was burned down either. I'm not entirely sure about that, but I think the house survived as well. But they certainly were in great danger, and they had to go. Also in the area, we have a place that is known as the Harmon House. That belonged to a man who also ended up being in Washington, D.C. at the time. Emmanuel Harmon was perhaps, among other things, an inventor, but he was not there at the time. He had a daughter named Amelia Harmon, and Amelia Harmon has given us one of the most vivid accounts, albeit it was given, I think, in 1915, some years later, of course, quite a bit later. But Amelia Harmon was only 16 years old at the time when her and her aunt were the only ones at home. Again, I believe her father was in Washington, and I'm not sure exactly where the uncle was, but there were no men in the house at the time. Not to be sexist or whatever, or what have you, but they were very unprotected. Very unprotected. It was a horrible situation, and I don't think that anybody, let alone any 16-year-old girls out there, would want to be in the same situation when there are Confederates stampeding across the field and coming your way. I sure as heck wouldn't want to be in that situation either, for the record. At first, the Harmon House was very briefly occupied by Union forces, but they got pushed back and had to evacuate because they saw way too many Confederates coming across Willoughby Run. So eventually, Amelia Harmon is in the basement with her aunt, and they can't see very well because I assume they're looking out what is more or less a window, but they can see the feet shuffle by as soon as they hear the rumbling of a couple hundred soldiers coming down the field very close to their home, and they look out the window, and they can't make much out above the knees, but they can see the bottom pant legs of the soldiers, and they were gray, and they knew they were Confederates, and they knew they were in great danger. Lucky for them, as I think was usually the case, Amelia Harmon, that the Confederates were not cruel, needlessly cruel, and did not care to take their lives unnecessarily. But they told them, of course, that they did have to leave because they were going to burn the house. And again, this is military tactics. The Union and the Confederates almost always did this as protocol, as I mentioned as well, in cupolas all over town. Whenever there was a house, let alone any building in an advantageous position or higher ground, or just a position that they thought could eventually be used against them, should they have to evacuate, and should the tide of that specific smaller battle shift again, then they didn't want that to be used against them. So they told them they had to leave and they were going to burn the house. And once again, property owners or residents at the time were faced with the decision: do we stay and do we try to defend the place? Do I try to put out the flames and hope they just go away and save the house, or save what we can, save some of the livestock, or do we just do the smart thing, the pragmatic thing, and go and GTFO? So they did leave. What's really amazing is, and I'm not sure exactly where Amelia Harmon ended up, very well could have been the seminary as well, but I'm not entirely sure. But I do know that it was an insanely scary experience for, you have to understand, I mean, in these kind of situations, ordinary citizens in the Battle of Gettysburg, and any situation then or now, even ones who show great courage at the time almost will tell you later that there was also a lot of fear racing through their heart at the same time. And that had to be the case with her. So they had to flee. And what's really impressive and just downright scary is that they actually exited the house, which was at that point starting to burn, and their path was between two rows, two columns of rebels, two massive columns of rebel troops, not knowing if they would be intercepted again, harassed, or worse, the slight off chance put to death, or taken as perhaps prisoner, or what have you. But she did live. She did make it out, and she did make her way to safety wherever that was. I'm at 17 minutes. This has gone on a lot longer than most of my shoots, but luckily I'm shooting this off of my phone, so I could zoom in on stuff for you, and because the wind outside would not permit me to get out and walk around and do this. It's really terrible because I can just never win, right? The last time I was here, and the last few times I've been here, it has been nothing but gray, gray, gray. Of course, hopefully some of you have seen the mist and fog shots or shoots. I think I've just posted one of them so far. Those were really nice, but the other days I could have done with more sun and less gray. Now I've got sun. It's very, very cold for very late March. We're topping out here today in the mid to upper 40s, and there was a ton of wind, so I just could not possibly shoot this outside walking around. So apologies for that, but I hope you enjoyed my synopsis, my perhaps not entirely accurate, of course, synopsis, but generally accurate synopsis of the very first actual smaller battle within the larger Battle of Gettysburg. Again, the opening shot was a mile down the road, but this was the opening battle of the larger Battle of Gettysburg. So hope you guys enjoyed. I will see you again soon.